Hello and welcome back to Read Becca for another weekly chatty catch-up on everything I've read, everything I'm currently reading, and everything I'm looking forward to reading. And I read much less than I expected to, but yet I'm still having a very voracious December in reading, so I still have several things to wrap up here. Let's start with the thing that I read in the previous week and didn't get to talking about, which was Starling House by Alix E. Harrow. And I'm again not going to totally talk about it a little bit. I want to talk about it a little bit. And that's because I'm going to wrap it up more with the following book that I read, which is Revelator by Darryl Gregory, because they're both sort of Appalachian Gothic. I somehow stumbled on two books that have that vibe at the same time, and not something I've ever heard anybody talk about before, but I certainly think they fit together. So Starling House feels like the more traditional style of Gothic, where it is centered at an old, creepy manor house known as Starling House. And we are following Opal, who's in her mid-20s in this rundown, kind of dying town. And she takes care of her younger brother. He seems to be mid-teens, about heading toward the end of high school. And so they're in a transitional period, and her whole life after their mom's death has been centered on caring for him and protecting him. But in the story, as she's sort of facing great change in her life, I would think, she has started having dreams from her childhood about Starling House bubbling back up in her life. And that draws her back to Starling House. She meets the man who lives there, Arthur Starling, and he offers her a job a bit grudgingly. And then she starts working cleaning the house. And more ominous things happen. Right from the get-go, this novel, it's definitely non-real stuff that's going on. So we do have certainly paranormal, supernatural things happening, which I prefer in my Gothic stories. I like it to not be left to question. And I loved what it is doing with the paranormal stuff. Really, really great things. I also really love the characterization. Both Opal and her younger brother Jasper were fantastic. Arthur is a little bit abrasive, definitely, at least at first. There is a slight romantic element that not everyone has really liked, but I think it worked for me. It feels like it was very natural to what's happening, and it is not prominent or a really major thing. It is kind of integral to the story, but it doesn't take up a huge portion of the plot. And I just loved that this story is very focused on the history of this house. There is a children's book author who was the first resident of this house who wrote and drew kind of creepy images. And those images have somewhat burrowed into Opal's mind. And that really is the draw and connection of this eerie old house. I did listen to this on audio, and the eerie and ethereal qualities did not come through in the audio here. It was a very big disappointment there because the narrator was not bad, but it seemed more like a thriller narration where she has kind of a raspy voice and she constantly is in a heightened emotional state, even though our character has been through really hard stuff, and I found that very unbelievable that the character, if she were constantly going through all of these hard things, she wouldn't be hysterical every time something difficult happens. She would be used to reacting and managing those situations, and that did not come through in the audio narration. So I felt it didn't fit, and I think this is the second audiobook recently that's happened, where it was just like the total wrong vibe for the book. So I have already ordered a physical copy, and I'm very much looking forward to actually reading it, because it was very spooky, and it totally lived up to Alix Harrow's sense of atmosphere, building on what the history of this house is and the depths below it. So I loved that one, and then I really enjoyed as well Revelator by Darryl Gregory, and this one's super shiny, so I'm not gonna hold it up all the time. Revelator is also Appalachian Gothic, but it is historical and has much more of a Southern Gothic vibe to me than traditional Gothic. We are set in very rural Smoky Mountains, hill country. We're following Stella as she is a young child in the first timeline in the 1930s. Her father is driving her to drop her off at her grandmother's and leave her there to grow up, basically. And there are all of these things about their house, and their house having its own church. Even though they're members of the Baptist church, they don't really attend, and they're kind of viewed as heathens by the neighbors in the community. But they have a church on their own property where they worship the god in the mountain. And she goes into the church, and she discovers that there is a hole, and goes in the hole and sees something. And that's kind of our opening scene. And then the alternate timeline that we are also getting there is in the late 1940s, and Stella's now an adult. She's a moonshiner, so we get a lot of activity surrounding her having built a community around being this really good moonshiner. And that part was, I think, really fun and kind of pulls us separate from the gothic elements, but really builds her as a character. But there's also now a new girl who has come to live with her grandmother, and all of these Birch women, her family name is Stella Birch, so all of the Birch women are a little unusual, and they are revelators for this church of their family, and they are kind of the voice of their god, and yet they don't really have any power and voice compared to the men in their family. And so I just loved the way that this explored the religious themes, the gothic aspects. I feel like the sense of atmosphere and the unlikable characters really, really worked here, and the setting and the people being part of the place really, really was just fantastic. I think it was executed so well by Gregory. So this was actually my second book from Darryl Gregory, and I hated the first one. I read Spoonbinders, which is by far his most famous, I think, and it was up for awards, and I just didn't like it. I really, really found that the unlikable characters there, everyone is unlikable in that book, didn't work for me, and clearly that's not the case for most. But I knew this book had come out and heard an interview of him talking about it, and it absolutely made me think that I need to jump on that book, and so I'm glad I did. This came out a couple years ago now, but he has one other book that has really intrigued me as well, so I definitely am on board with checking out something else from him in the future, because this was great. I really enjoyed it. Then I read The Skull by John Clausen, and this was delightful, if a bit morbid, because we're following Attila, who goes out in the snowy night and starts wandering through the snow until she finds an eerie old house, and when she knocks on the door, she finds a skull. And it's a talking skull who used to live there and now, I guess, unlives there? Undead's there? I don't know. But the skull inhabits this old manor house. However, something very creepy happens every night, and the skull warns Attila, and it's so cute, the little adventures they have through the day, and then them kind of coming together at night over their fear of this thing that's going to happen. This did not have the ending I expected, though. It has a very clear sense of what should happen, like what would be natural to happen, but it's not that. And I was a little bit disappointed at that, because that would have been a very happy, cozy ending, and this kind of has a happy ending, but it's a different happy ending for sure, and it goes a little dark at points. And this one is labeled a Tyrolean folktale as well, because it apparently is a folktale that he encountered in a library in Alaska. He forgot the name of, and had to actually get in touch with the library to get that information. So he talks about that a little bit in the author's note. But it was just a delightful story that he kind of tweaked what he wanted out of the story based on his sort of inaccurate memory, and I really like that concept. I did pick this one up because Jack from Spreadbook Joy had done a really fantastic review of it. I did not know Clausen had a new book out until she mentioned it, so I will link Jack's review down below, because she covers it in immense detail much better than I could, and really showcases this work. And then I read Mammoths at the Gates by Niveau, the latest in the Singing Hills cycle. And let me just read you quickly the start. This is the fourth book, I think, in this series. This is a little bit from chapter 1. She couldn't help smiling, not when they were so close, when the earth smelled right, and the cicadas filled the air with a thunderous buzz. In another few weeks, the cicadas would all be dead, and the novices would sweep up drifts of golden husks to be crushed and added to the compost bins. I made it back in time for the cicadas, they thought. I'm going home to the Singing Hills Abbey, they said. So I just love this entry. Because this is the fourth, I can't really talk too much about it, but this also does stand on its own, much like every other entry in this series. And Chi is a cleric from the Singing Hills Abbey in this kind of lightly fantastical world. It definitely has fantasy elements to it. They are a traveling cleric who goes around all over the countryside collecting stories, and that's the purpose of their abbey, really, is collecting history. And they also have these really wonderful, what look like hoopoe birds, but they're actually spirits called Nixon, who are sort of memory spirits. And over the past, I think, 2 books, Chi, our cleric, has not had their hoopoe bird with them, named Almost Brilliant. And so in this one, we do see cleric Chi coming back to see Almost Brilliant, finally, because Almost Brilliant has been at the abbey with a nesting. She's got a baby along with her now in this story, and I loved that touch. So as far as this story this is now my second favorite after the first book in this series, Empress of Salt and Fortune, because it's so quiet. And to that passage that I read you, it's about coming home and going through recognizing and recentering yourself as they're dealing with grief and also change on both sides. Both she has really visibly changed in many ways, and the Abbey has changed in their absence. They've been away for years, and a lot of things have happened. This does include some major grief, to what I was saying, including a funeral, and it got so under my skin because I find it really annoying that people make funerals about what they want instead of about the person who's being given the funeral. And so that got under my skin a little bit, but appropriately. So I think that was the point. So we see a lot more contention, I think, in this novel than we have in many of the others, where we've had some drama and action, but this was very much emotional tension, I think. And I think it wrapped up in such a beautiful way that I did just love this. This is a series that every entry is just so magical and peaceful, and it really touched me. I think, to my video a couple of weeks ago about reflecting on who we are and change over the years, this had a lot of those themes, so it was really hitting me at the moment personally. And finally, I read Summer in the City of Roses. This was not on my radar at all, except that the Le Guin Prize highlighted it. I have never seen anyone else talk about this book, but this is a YA novel set in Portland. It's not quite contemporary, but it seems like it's a contemporary-ish, maybe the 90s, I think. I don't believe at any point we're actually told what time this is. However, there's a lot of pop culture references, and I'm gathering that those were probably 90s. And very much about, as it goes on, things like the rise of sort of punk and grunge culture in the music scene in Portland. And I think, based on the author's note, things coming into a confluence where Portland went from kind of a little known city to a really booming place of art and culture. And so this is about that. We are following two kids who are named Or and Aoife. Fittingly, their dad is Greek, so those are more traditional, I guess, Greek names based on the mythic figures, Iphigenia and Orestes. So I'm not really overly familiar with that mythology, but it is recounted a bit in here, so that should help you. And this story does loosely follow that. And that was maybe one of the elements that didn't work as well for me, is that this is trying to pull in too many different references. There are references to things like Robin Hood. There are lots of references to Shakespeare and quotes of Shakespeare. There are lots of pop culture references to what I said. It just feels like it's doing an awful lot. But this starts out as a very straight up general fiction story, I would say, and only at the end does it finally become fantastical. So in the general fiction story, things are in a hard place at the beginning. It's sort of a blow up of the family. So we're alternating perspectives from Eve and Or over this story, and what happens at the beginning is pretty traumatic, I would say. I feel like maybe at points this book didn't treat it as seriously as it should have, in that Eve and her dad have gone out to this big gala. Their mom has gone away for a few months to California to do a dance residency because she's a dancer and she is very passionate about this particular project. And so she's going to completely focus on this. And so the kids are there with dad in their Portland suburb. And at this gala, her dad tells her that he has had her brother picked up to be taken away to a boot camp. And it's pretty clear that this is something on par with, I would consider something like a conversion camp. It's going to be extremely traumatic. And as we're going through the first part and we're figuring out why Eve is responding so severely to this, is because Or seems to be non-neurotypical in some way, certainly hypersensory. There is a lot of talk about his hair being very important to him and not cut because the weight of it and the waves of it hanging down around his face, just the feeling of that is comforting to him and very important. That he has a lot of meltdowns and that they've worked through a lot of things over the years, both himself and how his dad reacts to him. And now we're finding out, that his dad has basically sent him away to turn him into a real boy. And that was very horrifying to read at the beginning. And I think that was handled well through parts of the story, but I think it was sort of swept under the rug in the end, and I really didn't like that. realistic, yes, but I don't like that being depicted in a YA book. Like, that should be very strongly condemned in a YA book for me. So as a result, though, what this means is that Eve hears this news from her dad, and she runs off into the night, basically. As well, we start getting Orr's perspective, and he also manages to escape. He reacts so severely that he's able to get away, and even though he was just kidnapped and taken by these experts who are used to doing this, he's gone off into the night as well. And so we wind up in this very frenetic story of these two kids loose in Portland, them encountering and making friendships with people who they end up staying with, them sort of getting back in contact with their dad eventually, and realizing that, you know, they have their own lives ahead of them, and figuring out who they want to be and what they want from life. And it is very, very fevered in that normal real setting part, but once it gets into the fantastical parts toward the end, where there are some definite non-real things going on, it's especially fevered. It turns into a realistic, like, fever dream at the end. And at points of that fever dream, I feel like the author maybe was just throwing things at the wall a bit. But I did also very much like this. This was a book of two halves for me, where the stuff I really didn't like was just, yeah, I hate this. This is terrible. But the stuff I did like was like 5-star book. So I'm surprised I haven't heard about this author, because I think that her work would work really well for quite a lot of people I know. Much of this story actually reminds me a ton of Rent, the musical, because we have these, you know, as I said, very frenetic. It's about people in this whirlwind over the course of a very short period of time, and all of these people keep circling around each other. Eve and her brother, Orr, are both connecting up with people who are also interconnected with one another, and so there are so many near misses, and there's so many cool vibes about artistic culture and creativity, and to what I was saying earlier about the music culture. Orr winds up staying with a girl punk band called the Furies. And so we do get connected in with that whole music scene, and that part reminds me immensely of Rent, and how all of these creatives living poorly and still having a great time, and, you know, even though they're going through all of these struggles. So I had that same vibe. Who I would recommend this to, I don't know. Because of when it's set and the pop culture references, I feel like that doesn't appeal a lot to a teen today. I think I could see this being good for maybe a YA reader who is like a theater kid, or maybe even people who were theater kids when I was a kid, when this was appropriate, like at the 90s. That probably would be the most appealed to reader by this book. But the writing was gorgeous, so I actually would be interested to check out something else from this author. I do believe they have other work, so yeah, it was a weird one, but I'm very glad the Le Guin Prize turned me onto it and made me aware of this author. So I think that is everything that I read this week. That's a pretty good pile. I think I did okay. As far as sort of reading things, I did actually start 2 books. I started The Supper of the Lamb, A Culinary Reflection by Robert Farrar Capon, and Marks for Cats, A Radical Bestiary by Lee Claire LaBerge. And I picked these both up as potential gifts for Christmas for people. Started them very briefly just to check them out, to see if that was the case, and I confirmed both I want to read them and I wanted to give them as gifts as intended. So I have since bought already a second copy of each of these that have been wrapped up and ready to be shipped off. So those will be sitting, I think, until next year though, and I will restart them. As far as my next actual priority for reading, I have Paladin of Souls. I started this on audio and lost the audio, and so I need to get back to it. I want to finish this before the year is out, because this is from my TBR this year and a sequel. And I have from the library Something Wild and Wonderful by Anita Kelly, left over from my romances from November. I definitely want to get through this one as well. And I actually am down to only 4 things physically from the library to get to, so that seems very manageable before the end of the year. I would love to finish all my library stuff and get it all returned in time. Maybe, maybe. So yeah, so all of these books and my audiobook, which I will actually talk about next week. I did finish an audiobook, but I think I've covered enough. All of these in an audiobook, I thought I was going to finish last weekend, and because I was halfway through Revelator and the audiobook, I did not finish either of those, much less start anything else. So my reading has been much slower than expected, despite the massive pile I've just wrapped up for you. So that's all right. But I did do a vlog for Mid-Month Book Bash with very little reading. So I decided that will go up eventually. And so you will see me do lots of stuff, say how tired I am, and not read very much. It does mean I'm a little behind where I thought I was going to be, but to everything I have said, I think I'm doing like really, really well for how busy I've been. I am still quite managing as far as getting things back to normal. You can see my shelves are not quite full yet. I'm slowly moving things back in chunks, and I have this shelf. This is my favorite shelf, about halfway full. It's chaos down there. This is slightly managed piles over here that I've made nice for filming. I finished my TBR shelf completely, so that is all back in order. And then my other two major shelves that are in here are somewhat started to get back to order, or not order, but they have a few piles of books that are going to go on those shelves out. So I have a lot of work for those two shelves because they are mostly empty. So I'm gonna have to get to work on that this weekend. I am trying to manage things in bite-sized chunks. So maybe not even a whole task, just a piece of a task at a time. And the fact that I'm doing this along with all the Christmas stuff, like I still have to finish getting presents wrapped, shipped, cards out. I have a lot left, but it's being managed. I also, as a result of being completely overloaded, completely missed the Goodreads Choice Award final vote. So I didn't vote in the Goodreads Choice Awards. It has been interesting because I think, I'm kind of in the same bucket as most other people where I don't really care. This year has been even less than usual. I was not enthusiastic about really any of the winners or much of anything that was up in the last round. So, I have been very disappointed with the discourse surrounding it though, like the responses and the negativity about it and people just crapping on the winners. Clearly enough people liked those things to vote for them. So just crapping on those things is very saddening to me, as well as a lot of very gatekeepy responses to the way things fell in genres. There were some, Starling House is a great example because it's not fantasy. It is fantastical. So it has a toe in the fantasy genre, certainly, and it can fit there, yes. But it's a pretty traditional Gothic story, so it really belonged as a Gothic story in horror. And it's silly that it got shelved in fantasy, but the reality is that Goodreads is doing this based on shelvings, and those genre shelvings for buzzy releases happen before the book is even out, a lot. So I'm not really blaming Goodreads so much as the fact that this is a flaw of crowdsourcing your information. A lot of people shelve things wrong. And then, being gatekeepy about other stuff. A lot of people were very negative about what ended up in fantasy, saying, oh, well, that's not fantasy. It is fantasy. Like, fantasy is not just traditional epic fantasy. Like, people who read this stuff are fantasy readers, and that's okay. Yeah. So it was, the negativity was very high in everything that I've seen so far. People are also very much overwhelming my video queue as a result. A lot of Goodreads Choice Award related videos have gone up, a lot of lives and prepared vlog type videos that were like an hour long, all of them, which is great. I love all the content, but it meant about a week ago, I was feeling so on top of things. I had caught up on my watch later queue and watched some of my really ancient videos that I have some in queue that are almost a year old now that I just never got caught up from last Vlogmas, basically. And then I started re-adding all of the new videos. It had been like 4 days, I think. And in those 4 days, there were over 250 videos that I added to my watch later queue. So I'm now completely snowed under again and catching up on watch later, and so many long videos. So I'm gonna be catching up well into January, I'm quite sure. I'm still trying to keep up-ish, but not doing well. It's a great problem to have though. I love being able to see everybody so excited about books. And people have already started putting out their end of year best of lists too, so that is going to shape a lot of things about how I think about books I want to pick up next year. Yeah, so I'm not ready to wrap up the year at all. As far as this past week, it was a really exciting week. I think the mid-month book bash vlog will cover a lot of exciting things. I have not really done that much. I had a very work-focused week this week, unfortunately, but I did have fun last weekend. I went to Cirque du Soleil, and that was so great. It was their Christmas show, obviously, and it was one of those shows that, like, the show was phenomenal, but the audience chemistry was really off. So that really put a damper on things, but it was still such a phenomenal show. Cirque du Soleil is always amazing, but that kind of disappointed me. The music was so good. So they really outdo themselves with the music they pick. and here it was like top notch. There was a song that was a sort of like haunting children's choir version of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, but with, I'm 90% sure, or even more than that, that it was a sample from Portishead's Glory Box run under it, of the actual music. So if you know what that song is, please tell me, or if you know how to find out what it was, please tell me, because I have done everything I can to try and find that, and I can't. So I really am like, have that running through my head and desperately want to hear it again because it's so good. Yeah, I think that's it for week stuff. Christmas movies, I have been watching a lot of those. I don't think I talked about any of the watching stuff last week. I've been watching a lot of baking shows, the holiday baking shows. Obviously, I've watched both of the Great British Bake Off holiday shows, and that reiterated that I'm glad, you know, Matt was only there for a season, because that was not ideal. I also watched 3 Christmas movies, holiday rom-coms. The first one was Christmas Fix Up. That was probably 2 weeks ago, and I don't think I've talked about. And that one is kind of following this woman who is a very business-focused TV presenter who does a fixer-upper type show. And she's so focused on her work, she's not as connected with her personal life, and is kind of in the big city away from her small coastal hometown, right? So, of course, over the course of the beginning of this, she's being pushed by her producer that she needs to show her more personal side and, you know, soften up a little bit in order to improve her career, basically. Like, she needs to be more open with her as an actual person instead of being this well-polished presenter. And so she decides to do that by going back home because a place that's very dear to her was hit by a storm, and they have a usual yearly Christmas party that they host, and they're not going to be able to do that if there's, you know, a big hole in their building. So she's going to work and to show her personal side. She's going to fix up this building. And so she does that, and of course runs into her ex. And he happens to be in the same line of business. So it is this lovely, I guess, second chance story of them coming back together and grudgingly working together and then kind of working through the differences that they had before. And it's also, of course, this beautiful holiday setting because this place is always decked out for the holidays and they really host these great events. And so it was lovely. It was the most cheesy of the 3, I think, that I watched. The next one I watched was Christmas Ever After. And this one was great, though admittedly cheesy, but it was such a vibe that I love. So it is following a woman who is a writer, and she writes romance novels. And she has major writer's block, and her final draft is due by Christmas. Which makes no sense. If you're writing a holiday novel and you want to release it for the holiday, you're not submitting that to your editor on the holiday, right? So the suspension of disbelief for us has to be high as readers and people who know a lot about publishing, right? So this one, cheese factor was high as well, but I really enjoyed it. So she has a B&B that she goes to that's very holiday winter themed, and she goes there for the holiday every year, and she kind of talks her editor into saying, oh yeah, I can work from there and it will really inspire me. So she goes, and it turns out the new owner who is preparing to take over this B&B that she has always gone to looks exactly like the character on her cover of her romantic hero, Desmond Raines, who she's been writing about forever and now has a block and can't write about. So I just love that premise, obviously. I mean, like, who reads romance and wouldn't love that premise? But on top of that, the main protagonist is played by Alix Stoker, who is a very well-known Broadway actress who is also wheelchair bound. And so there are also some singing moments that are incorporated there. It's not a musical, but it's appropriately like seasonal holiday singing. And yeah, I loved seeing her in that role and really hamming it up in her kind of Broadway skills. Very much liked it, very much liked it. And the last one was the one that was kind of most on the bubble for me, as when I might drop like a hot potato very quickly if it went south. But it surprised me and wound up being my favorite of these, and that was Christmas as Usual. It is a Norwegian film, so most of it is subtitled, but it does alternate between English and Norwegian. And this one follows a woman and her recent fiance. They haven't told her family yet, and they're flying back to Norway for him to meet the family. However, she has not told them that he is Indian, and he doesn't know that. He doesn't know how little she has shared with her family at all, or that they're going to be kind of weird about it. And that premise yeah, put my hackles up a little bit. I was like, I'm gonna try it. This one has some promise based on the trailers and stuff, but if they really like lean into xenophobia, that's gonna be not great. Like, it could have gone Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and like really hammed it up. They do go for some low-hanging fruit in the jokes, certainly, because it is a goofy holiday rom-com, but I think mostly it was done very well and appropriately focused on the fact that our heroine is the one who made it weird. Like that she's the one really at fault here for not communicating with the people she loves in multiple aspects, not just her family, about this person who is going to become, you know, her fiance and the most important person in her life, but she's also withheld things from her future partner. And so I think they put the emphasis in the right place and went through the family sort of overcoming the barriers that were mostly to do with her, and they're being caught off guard more so than that they had, you know, a xenophobia or racism problem. So I wound up liking this one very much, and it giving us the Nordic Christmas experience, like the vibe of it being absolutely snowy, the obsession with Christmas and really having beautiful, intricate Christmas details was so good that I wound up just really loving this one. So for me, this was one that's kind of up there toward the top of my favorite Christmas movies, I think. I might need to rewatch it maybe next year and see if it does hold up after a rewatch. But yeah, it was really, really good and I liked it very much. Oh, I should say, I think the first two of those I found on Hulu, and Christmas as Usual is on Netflix, and I think it's new this year, while the other two may be older. So I think that's it for this week for me. That's more than enough. This has gone on way too long. And my light, it's not even 3 o'clock. The light should not be moving, but I did at least catch some sunshine because it has been overcast the last day and a half or more. And it finally got sunny, so I was like, I'm gonna catch it to film. And now it's moving all over the place. So I think that's it for me. I will be back next week ahead of the holiday, hopefully with many more reads, and I am hoping to read a Christmas holiday romance book by then. So we will see if I get to it. Thank you so very much for watching.